particular video, and I'll be showing you how we can add our first line of CSS, right? So the first thing you want to put to mind is you want to start writing your first CSS, you have your HTML document, and where and how should I add my first CSS. Now, I will start by saying that where you want to include your CSS in your HTML is inside, most cases, is inside your head document, but there are three ways we can go about it, right? And these three ways that we can go about is, the first one, we call it what? Inline CSS. So you can write it down. So the first one is called what? Inline, so spelled like this, Inline CSS. So let's see how we can add our CSS. So now the first CSS I want to teach you guys, or the first property of CSS that I would love to teach you guys, with the property that is called what? Color, right? So that we can actually change the color. Now if I go back here, you can realize that welcome to GS, this is my first CSS, it's simply black and white, and even all the HTML that we have been writing is black and white. So let's see how we can change the color of this text to red. Now what I'm going to do now, I'm going to come inside here and I'm going to create my first CSS. My first attribute is called style, and I'll say style is equal to, in quotes here, and this quote is going to give me like a color, right? So, and the property that I want to add here is called color, so I'm going to say color. And remember our syntax, we said the property colon semi the value and the semicolon. Now the value of color can be different kind of color codes, right? So later we're going to treat like different color codes that we can have. So for now, let's have red. I will say name. So the value of color could either be name of the color, the hex color code, or RGB, right? So in most cases now you see hex color code. Okay, let's go on Google and search for something. Just go on Google and search for hex color codes, right? So if you search for hex color code, you are going to see several stuff. So let us open this one and see what's happening there. Let's open the first one. So we are going to see like several color codes, and you basically don't cram these things, right? I don't think anybody crams them. So you see like several color codes here, and you see all these are several color codes. This one is for blue, blah blah, and the rest. So you don't need to even cram them. So if I want purple now, I could just pick this and it's going to give me purple. But before I start picking the color code, let's see how it's going to look like. So this is red, so I'm going to save this. I'm going to come in here now and I will refresh, and I'm going to have red, right? So if I want this color to be another color, I can simply just pick this purple in here. So this is hex color code. So as you can see here, we have like three types of color. We can have the name of the color, which is all of this. We could have the RGB of the color, or we can have the hex color code. Now they have other color codes that we have that are not hex color code, but these are one of the major and the widely used color codes whenever we are coding, right, or writing our CSS. So I'm going to come in here and I'll just paste this, and when I do that and I refresh now, I'm going to have what? Purple, right? In the same way too, we have the RGB. So if we want to use the RGB, let's use the RGB to give us red. So the highest number of the RGB is 255, from 0 to 255 each. So RGB stands for red, green, and blue. So we could just add RGB and paste this. So the first one is red, the second one is green, the last one is blue, right? So if I save this and I come back here now and I refresh, I'm going to have red as well. So we're talking about three different values that colors can have: the RGB color code, the hex color code, and the name of the color. Now one good thing about VS Code is that you can even change, you can select a color from VS Code. You just need to highlight it here, just bring your cursor, hover on top of it, and if you click here, it's going to change it to the hex color code, the HSL, this is another type of color code as well, the HWB, the RGB, the hex color code as well. So, or you can just simply just move these stuffs around and pick any color. Let's say we want green and I want the darker version of green. I could pick this here and automatically VS Code will change that particular color for me. And when I refresh, I have my green, right? So what we just did right now, we just created a CSS, but this kind of CSS is inline CSS. Why is it called inline CSS? Because we added it inside where the tag is being opened, right? And inline CSS is added with the tag using the style attributes. Don't forget, inline CSS, we use style attributes to add it and inside the tag. So if I want to add inline CSS to this H1 now, I need to create like a style attribute style attribute is equals to in quotes, right? Normal HTML style attribute. Then we'll now add our CSS. Remember, the syntax of CSS is property. I'm just repeating myself so you get this concept, then the value, because once you get this concept, you automatically understand CSS. In fact, the everything about CSS is just basically in this particular concept. Know that your CSS is property and value, right? And the example of the property that we treated this time around is what? Color, right? And the value now could be that name, hex color code, or any of those things, right? And in this case, I'll give it red, right? So now if I save it and go back to my browser and refresh, my heading is going to have this big red color, right? Which is super amazing. Now, another way that we could add CSS again is the inline CSS, right? Internal CSS, sorry. We've treated inline. So the second one is internal. Let me write it down here. Internal CSS. So the first one is inline CSS. The second one is in internal CSS. Now, the inline CSS will use style attributes, while the internal CSS we're going to use what we call the style tag, and it will be instead of our heading, right? Our header. So here now I'm going to come in here. I'm going to say style. I'm going to open and close a tag called style tag. Now, once I have that done, the next thing I want to do is to start to write my CSS, right? But before I write the regular CSS that we know, I would want to treat what we call selectors, CSS selectors. I want us to treat what we call CSS selectors, right? CSS selectors. So what exactly are CSS selectors? So CSS selectors allow us to pick or target a particular tag that we want to style, right? And in CSS we have like three major selectors basically. We have the tag selector, we have the class selector, and we have the ID selector. So these are three different selectors that you can see inside of CSS. So I will go through them one after the other, but for the first time, let's just go through the tag selector, right? So I'll take this off, then you can actually write it down. So I'll say H, then write another H1. I will now say tag selector. Let me just use the word tag selector here, right? And I'll put another P here. I will say testing. Yeah, I'm spelling it well. Testing tag selector. Now, when you're working with tag selector, I want you to know something. Is the fact that you can select all of the whole tag inside that particular element and style it. But let's take a look at the syntax first. If you're working with selectors, what you want to start with is selector. The syntax of selector, you want to start with selector like this. Curly braces, that is open and close of your curly braces. Then you can now start writing your CSS, which will be property, colon, then value, right? Semicolon. So this is what you just want to like memorize. So now this is like two different properties under CSS that I've actually explained to you guys. The first one is just property and value. Now this second one now is that you have a selector, you now have property and value, the same CSS syntax, but now we are having what selector, so that we can use this selector, idea of this selector, to target it and actually add our CSS to it. Now in this case, we want to use the tag selector like H1, right? So I'll change this one to H1, and I can now say, okay, the color, my property I want to give it now is color, and I'll say let the color be, let's say, green, right? Now all of what this stuff will do is that it will select all of the H1 inside this particular web page and ensure that the color of those H1s are green. But of course, the inline CSS, it will be overridden by the inline CSS. So let's save this and see what will happen. You see, it is now green. This H1 is now green just because of this H1. I've selected this particular H1. So any color I change this thing to, let me change it to something else. Purple, okay, blue. Let me change it to blue, like light blue, like this. I'll save this now. If I refresh, you see I have blue. So even if we create another one, let's say tag selector 2, if we create another tag selector again, it is still going to be blue. So no matter the number of H1, in fact, let me just do Ctrl C, Ctrl V, duplicate it multiple times. So no matter the number of that H1 that we are going to have this particular property, this particular CSS applied to them. So, and that is why it is called what? Tag selectors, right? So same thing, if I want to style the P tags, there is the paragraph tag, and I want it to be what now, any other color, let's say green, I'll just put the name of the tag there, which is P, my curly braces, then I'll now start applying my CSS. I'll now say color, then I'll now say let's say purple, for example. Let me spell that purple out. Then if I save it, I'm going to have like testing purple. So this is basically CSS for you. If you just know these things I just explained now, you automatically know CSS. Now, the second kind of selectors that we could use is a selector that I call the class selector. So let's try class selector out. So for us to try class selector, I want us to do something very simple. Still making use of our h1 and so on and so forth. I would just say h1 here, and that h1 now, I'll give it a class. Now, the class you are going to give it to be any name of your choice, right? So just give it any name, anything that you like, just give it. I don't know what should call this now. So let's just call this one heading, right? Any name, anything that you give it is going to work, right? Then let's call this one testing class, right? Testing class selector. All right. So now, even without us actually creating this class, you see what will happen. The tag selector will be the one that's affecting it, right? The tag selector is already affecting it and it's giving it blue. But if we create a class, for us to create class, now we'll use that period sign. We'll start with period sign, which is full stop, and we'll say heading, then as our selector. Now, the reason why I called it heading here, it is because of I named it heading here. Right, so if you create it as heading any name, why it is class, it is because of you started with this particular dot. If you do it like this, hey, it will be saying it as CSS will be saying it as a tag selector, of course. But if you just put this period sign on top of it, in front of it like this, whatever name you start with period by naming it, you know that it's a class. Then anywhere that you want to use it, you use it with this class attribute, right? This class attribute, say class is equal to, in quotes, whatever name that you created it with, right? Then now you can now start applying your CSS inside of it again. Then you can now say column. Let's use for okay, let's use this one, blue violet. All right, I'll save this, and if I refresh now, it will give me that particular blue violet. That is because of I've used this particular class selector to apply my CSS, right? So the second way, the third way I could actually apply under the third selector that we could use is what we call the ID selector. So ID and class is basically like the same thing, right? Same concept. All I just need to do is to call this ID, and probably let's call this one something else, right? Let's just call it top header, or let's just call it header. I don't want to use heading again. Let's just call it header and testing ID selector, right? Header, and I would come in here now. I will say, instead of starting with dot sign, I'll start with what, hash. You could see that I'm starting with what, hash. So hash is telling me that it is what, ID selector. The period sign is telling me that it is what, class selector. Then I give it any name that I like. In this case, I named it what, header. Then I cannot give it any color of my choice, and let me give it any color. Let me give it this aqua color I'm seeing here. I'll save it, and I'll come over here and I'll have what's my ID selector. So basically, these are the three kind of selectors that we could use. We could use this one is the tag selector. That's the name of the tag. Then you apply your CSS, or the class selector. Remember, you need to start with what, the dot sign before the period sign, before any name that you choose to name your class selector. The same thing with the ID selector as well. You need to start with the hash sign with any name that you use your ID selector. So where you want to make use of your ID selector, you just need to call it by saying ID is equal to the name that you gave it, class is equal to the name that you gave it, while this other one is called what, inline CSS. So what we just practice now is called what, is internal CSS, because on every web page our CSS will live in there. Now there's another type of CSS, another way that we could include CSS, which is called the external CSS. Now for the external CSS, you don't need to include it inside your document, right? You don't need to include it inside your document, you just need to link it basically. And the moment you link it, you have access to that particular CSS. It's going to be an external CSS file, and you can use it on multiple pages. That is one of the importance of external CSS, because you can use that across your project just by linking it. So let's try out internal CSS out. So the first thing we're going to do, if you want to try out internal CSS, is to create a CSS file. Under our CSS here, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it style, and the file extension for CSS is called what? .css, right? So style.css, of course the name of the file could be anything. I just choose to name it style.css. Then it becomes an external CSS. Then all of this file here, I don't basically need them, so I'm going to cut it out. Let me delete this style that I have here. I'm going to cut it out and I'm going to place it inside here, and I'm going to save it, right, as external. So if I go back now, and you could see that all of the style of written, they are no longer working because I've removed it from that particular page and I've dropped it into an external file that I named style.css. So I don't expect them to actually work. So the way they can actually work is to link them right from an external file. So we have a special tag that enables us to do that, and that tag is what we call the link tag. So the link tag, we have link, it's an empty element tag, of course. It has two major attributes: the rel attribute, which will be equal to style sheet, and the href attribute that will be equal to their file location. So I'm going to start like this and I will link it. So with this now, that particular external CSS has been linked. So if I save this and I come over here and I refresh, I could have that particular CSS still working for me, right? Because I have actually linked it. So just for me to paraphrase, and we treated inline CSS style attribute, we treated internal CSS using the style tag, and we're treating external CSS using the link tag. We treated different kinds of selectors, 3 selectors. We treated the tag selectors, the class selectors, and the ID selectors, and how to make use of them. So basically, if you just know the simple concept of CSS that I just explained in this particular video, you already know CSS. Now in the subsequent videos, I'll be creating CSS. I'll be creating I'll be teaching you guys different CSS properties and how to use them basically. So thank you for watching this particular video, and I hope to see you in the subsequent video.